In today's video, I'm going to tell you the detailed story of Haruko, a Japanese factory worker captured during World War II who braced herself for violence and death. But when American soldiers entered her holding area, what they brought left her and dozens of other women absolutely speechless. Not rifles, not chains, but ice cream. This shocking true story reveals how a simple frozen dessert shattered years of propaganda and changed everything these women believed about their enemy, about war, and about what it meant to be human. September 2nd, 1945. The war was over, but for Haruko Tanaka, the terror had just begun. She knelt in the dust of a bombed-out warehouse on the outskirts of Osaka, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, surrounded by 43 other women. Some were factory workers like herself. Others had been nurses, clerks, or members of the Women's Auxiliary Corps pressed into service during Japan's final desperate months. Their ages ranged from 16 to 42. What united them was fear so absolute it felt like drowning. For weeks, their commanders had drilled the same message into their minds. Capture by Americans meant unspeakable horrors. They would be violated, tortured, and executed. Death was certain. Dignity was impossible. The only honorable path was to end their own lives before the enemy could lay hands on them. Some of the women had hidden shards of broken glass in their clothing. Others carried small vials of poison smuggled from medical supplies. Haruko herself had tied a leather cord around her neck, ready to pull it tight when the moment came. The sound of engines made them all flinch. American trucks rumbled into view, their olive green paint caked with dust, diesel fumes choking the air. Haruko pressed her forehead to the ground, her entire body trembling. She whispered a prayer to her ancestors, begging forgiveness for the shame she believed was coming. Around her, women wept openly. One girl, barely 17, collapsed entirely, her breathing shallow and panicked. The truck stopped. Boots hit the gravel. Haruko squeezed her eyes shut and waited for the rifle fire. Instead, she heard voices, American voices, speaking in broken Japanese with strange accents that would have been comical in any other context. No worry, no worry. Safe now. Safe? The word made no sense. She dared not lift her head. Minutes passed. Then a hand, firm but not rough, touched her shoulder and lifted her to her feet. She looked up into the face of a young American soldier, barely older than herself. He was smiling, not a cruel smile, not mocking, just tired and strangely kind. He gestured for her to stand in line with the others. That was the first shock. No violence, no shouting, just organization. The Americans moved efficiently, checking names against lists, distributing blankets, setting up a perimeter. Haruko stood frozen, unable to reconcile what she saw with what she had been told. Where were the demons? Where was the brutality? Then came the second shock, one that would haunt her for the rest of her life. A truck backed up to the center of the compound. Soldiers jumped out and began unloading metal containers, each one steaming slightly in the warm September air. The women watched in confusion. Was this poison? Gas? Some new weapon designed to kill them slowly? An American officer stepped forward. He spoke through a Japanese interpreter, a Nisei soldier who had grown up in California. The interpreter's voice was calm, almost cheerful. Ladies, the war is over. You are prisoners of war, yes, but you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will not be harmed. We have brought you something to help you understand this. He gestured to the containers. Soldiers pried open the lids, and a cloud of cold mist rose into the air. Haruko caught the scent first, sweet, creamy, utterly foreign. The interpreter smiled. Ice cream. American ice cream. Vanilla. We want you to have some. Ice cream. The words meant nothing to most of them. Japan had been starving for years. Milk was a memory. Sugar was a fantasy. Butter had vanished from markets so long ago that children didn't remember its taste. And here, these men who were supposed to be their executioners were offering frozen dessert, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. No one moved. The women stared at the containers with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Haruko's mind raced. This had to be a trick, poison disguised as kindness. A final cruelty before the end. The Americans seemed to understand their hesitation. The officer nodded, and several soldiers scooped ice cream into small paper cups. Then, deliberately, they ate it themselves. They laughed, joked, licked their spoons clean. One soldier even went back for seconds. Still, the women did not move. Finally, the interpreter stepped forward with a cup of ice cream and offered it to the oldest woman in the group, a former auxiliary nurse named Chio. She stared at it as though it might explode. Her hands shook as she accepted it. She raised the spoon to her lips, tasted it, and froze. Tears welled in her eyes, not from pain, from shock. The sweetness, the coldness, the richness of cream and sugar. It was so far beyond anything she had tasted in years that it felt like a hallucination. She took another bite, then another, and then she began to cry openly, her shoulders shaking as the ice cream melted in her mouth. That broke the dam. Other women stepped forward, timidly at first, then more boldly. Haruko found herself holding a cup, staring down at the pale, creamy substance. She took a small bite and nearly gasped. It was cold, impossibly cold, and the sweetness exploded across her tongue like fireworks. She had forgotten that food could taste like this. She had forgotten that such abundance even existed. Around her, women were weeping, laughing, staring at their empty cups in disbelief. Some asked for more, their voices small and hesitant. The Americans obliged without hesitation. They scooped generous portions, smiling as the women devoured every bite. Haruko watched as one soldier handed a second cup to a pregnant woman who had been too weak to stand. He helped her sit, made sure she was comfortable, and waited until she finished before moving on. This was not the behavior of conquerors. This was not the cruelty they had been promised. Haruko's mind struggled to process what was happening. The ice cream, so simple, so absurd in the context of war, had done something no weapon could. It had shattered the lies. That night, the women were given clean blankets and moved into barracks that, while basic, were far cleaner than the bunkers and shelters they had occupied during the war's final months. Electric lights hummed overhead, a luxury Haruko had not seen since blackout orders began years earlier. The air smelled of soap and disinfectant, not smoke and decay. Haruko lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning. The ice cream had been real. The kindness had been real, and if those were real, then what else had been lies? She thought of her younger brother, who had died on Okinawa, convinced that surrender was worse than death. She thought of her neighbors who had starved themselves to ration food for soldiers, believing that sacrifice would bring victory. She thought of the emperor's voice on the radio, trembling as he announced surrender, and how even then officers had whispered that the Americans would be merciless. But the Americans had brought ice cream. The absurdity of it was almost unbearable. Not bullets, not torture, ice cream. As if they wanted the women to live. As if they wanted them to know that the war was truly over. Whispers filled the barracks that night. Some women still insisted it was a trick, that execution would come tomorrow. Others argued back, pointing out that if the Americans wanted them dead, they would already be dead. Why waste ice cream on corpses? The debate raged in hushed tones, but beneath it all was a growing, undeniable realization. They were alive, and their captors seemed determined to keep them that way. The ice cream was not an isolated gesture. It was the beginning of something far larger. Over the following days, the women were introduced to a world of abundance they could scarcely comprehend. Meals arrived 3 times a day, not the thin gruel they had grown accustomed to, but actual food. Bread so soft it seemed like cake, stew thick with meat and vegetables, coffee that smelled like strength itself. Fruit, fresh fruit, appeared on their plates, apples and oranges that gleamed like treasures. Haruko watched as women who had been skeletal began to fill out. Cheeks that had been hollow gained color. Eyes that had been dull with starvation began to brighten. The transformation was physical, yes, but it was also psychological. Each meal was proof that the propaganda had been lies. Each bite was evidence that America was not starving, not collapsing, not weak. The medical examinations came next. At first, the women recoiled in fear, certain that doctors meant experimentation or worse, but the American medics were patient. They explained everything they were doing through interpreters. They treated infections with sulfa drugs and penicillin, medicines the women had heard of only in whispers. They bandaged wounds that had been festering for weeks. They gave vitamins to the malnourished and prenatal care to the pregnant. Haruko watched as a young woman with tuberculosis, who in Japan would have been left to die, was instead moved to an isolation tent where she was given medication and monitored daily. The woman's cough, which had rattled like death itself, began to ease within a week. Another prisoner, a factory worker who had lost 2 fingers in an industrial accident, received proper surgical care and antibiotics to prevent infection. She wept with gratitude, not because her fingers could be restored, but because someone cared enough to try. But it was the small gestures that struck deepest. Soldiers who brought extra blankets when the nights grew cold. Guards who offered cigarettes without being asked. An officer who noticed a woman shivering and gave her his own jacket, waving off her attempts to return it. These were not the actions of monsters. These were the actions of men who saw them as human beings. One afternoon, a group of women was brought to a warehouse to help sort supplies. Haruko found herself standing before mountains of crates, each one stamped with American labels. Canned goods, powdered milk, chocolate bars, medical supplies, clothing. The sheer volume was staggering. She had worked in a munitions factory during the war, where they rationed nails and recycled scraps of metal. Here, Americans threw away more in a day than her entire factory had produced in a month. She opened a crate and found it filled with bars of soap. Soap. In Japan, soap had become so scarce that families made their own from ash and animal fat. Here, it was stacked by the hundreds, discarded casually if the bars were slightly cracked or misshapen. Haruko held one to her nose and inhaled the clean, floral scent. It smelled like a world she had forgotten existed. That evening, as she washed her hands with American soap under running water that flowed endlessly from a tap, she realized the full weight of what had been stolen from her. Not just the war, not just her youth, but the truth. Her government had lied about everything. They had told her America was weak. They had told her Americans were cruel. They had told her that sacrifice and suffering were the only paths to honor. But the Americans had brought ice cream, and soap, and medicine, and kindness. And in doing so, they had destroyed every illusion she had ever been taught. As weeks turned into months, the women began to change in ways that went beyond physical recovery. They were given access to books and newspapers, materials that in Japan would have been censored or banned entirely. Haruko found herself reading American newspapers where different opinions were printed side by side, where citizens criticized their own government openly, where debate was not treason but democracy. She attended English classes taught by American soldiers who spoke with patience and humor. She learned words like freedom, rights, and choice. She practiced writing letters to American families who had donated supplies to the camp, families who wrote back with warmth and curiosity, asking about her life and sharing stories of their own. She received a photograph from a woman in Iowa who had sent a scarf. The woman's letter said simply, "I hope this keeps you warm. I hope you find peace." Peace. Haruko had not thought about peace in years. War had consumed everything. But now, surrounded by enemies who treated her with more dignity than her own commanders ever had, she began to imagine what peace might look like. She imagined a Japan rebuilt not on conquest, but on compassion. A Japan where children did not starve. A Japan where women did not kneel in the dust waiting for execution. The announcement of repatriation came in early 1947. The women would be sent home. Many wept, not from joy, but from confusion. They were leaving behind the abundance, the safety, the strange kindness of captivity. They were returning to a homeland in ruins, to cities burned, to families broken, to an uncertain future. On the day they boarded the ship, an American officer stood at the dock and addressed them through an interpreter. He thanked them for their cooperation, he wished them well, and then he said something that would stay with Haruko for the rest of her life. "We did not fight you because we hated you. We fought because we had to. Now that the war is over, we hope you will build a better future. We hope you will remember that enemies can become friends." As the ship pulled away from the harbor, Haruko stood on the deck and watched the American coast disappear into the distance. She thought about the ice cream. She thought about the soap and the medicine and the letters. She thought about the soldiers who had smiled at her, who had treated her wounds, who had given her blankets and hope. She thought about the world she had seen, a world of abundance and freedom, and she made a promise to herself. She would tell this story. She would make sure that no one forgot what she had learned. That mercy was stronger than cruelty. That humanity survived even in war. That enemies could indeed become friends. When Haruko returned to Japan, she found a country transformed. The emperor was no longer a god, but a man. Democracy was being built from the ashes. Women were gaining rights they had never known. And everywhere, people were asking the same questions she had asked in captivity. What had they believed? What had been lies? What could they build now that the illusions were gone? She became a teacher. She stood before classrooms of thin, hungry children and taught them not just reading and mathematics, but the lessons she had learned as a prisoner. She told them about the ice cream. She told them about the American soldiers who had shown her that strength did not require cruelty, that power did not demand brutality, that compassion could exist even between enemies. She taught them that democracy was not chaos, but a system where voices mattered, where debate was strength, where people could build a better world together. In later years, when historians asked her about her experience, she always returned to the same moment: the ice cream. That absurd, impossible gesture that had shattered her world and rebuilt it anew. "We thought they would hit us," she would say, her voice soft but steady. "We thought they would kill us. Instead, they brought ice cream. And in that moment, everything we believed collapsed. Because how could we fear people who wanted us to taste something sweet?" The ice cream had not erased the war. It had not undone the suffering. But it had proven that even in the darkest moments, humanity could survive. And that lesson, more than any weapon, more than any victory, was what truly changed the world. Haruko lived to see Japan rise from the ruins and become one of the most prosperous nations on earth. She saw former enemies become allies. She saw her students grow into leaders who build a country founded not on conquest, but on cooperation. And she knew deep in her heart that it had all begun with a simple act of kindness. A frozen dessert offered to women who expected death. A gesture so small and yet so powerful that it had rewritten history. Because in the end, the greatest victories are not won on battlefields. They are won in moments of mercy, in acts of compassion, in the choice to see the humanity in those we are taught to hate. And sometimes they are won with something as simple and as profound as ice cream.